This is Distant Replay. Glad to have you on Distant Replay. I'm Ben George. He's Mike Noto. We do documentary recaps just about every single week. Today we are talking about Untold, Malice at the Palace. This is on Netflix. It's part of, like I assume this is part of Untold being a bigger docuseries that's going to cover a number of different topics. But the focus of this one that's out now on Netflix is the Malice. And, you know, anytime we see Malice at the Palace, we're all in.
Oh, completely all in. And we did a whole recap of this game a long time ago for the podcast. And at the time we said, why hasn't anyone done a documentary on this event yet? And lo and behold, we have it now.
Yeah, so we're going to go through, and this is very interesting because it kind of gives you the other side of the story, essentially. We all kind of made up our mind. We heard the NBA's opinion on all the Pacers involved in this, but now we get to hear from everybody involved that day. Ron Artest, Stephen Jackson, Jermaine O'Neal, Reggie Miller had a good insight on that, as well as Donnie Walsh, is the GM or president, Mike, of the Pacers.
At the time, I think he was the GM and Larry Bird was the president.
Gotcha. So we'll go through all that today, and it's very interesting, and I think it's well worth watching if you are a fan of NBA or just history or really keened in on this event as it happened before back in 2004. You can find us online at distantreplaypodcast.com, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Please hit that like button, leave us a comment. Give us a request if you have something for us to go back and watch and do a show on. So this one, Mike, now I thought what was cool about this, and I guess it makes sense, the title is Untold. So basically you get to kind of hear the untold story involving this. What I thought was fascinating is hearing it from all the players involved, because they were made out to be the horrible person in this situation. They were made out to be the people that just couldn't control their emotions, that crossed that line by going into the stands. But you go back and listen to it. I mean, for the most part, there's a couple of guys in here that maybe don't come off too well, but I think for the most part, it was really refreshing to hear their side of the story, and you kind of understood where they're coming from, and you kind of felt bad for the way this all went down after the fact.
Yeah, and this is the first time I've heard a lot of these guys talk about the event, like guys who were significantly involved in length. And I think what's important for any documentary, I know I sound like a broken drum, but everyone that was intricately involved in this, except for maybe one or two people, were front and center in this documentary, explaining everything, as they put it a lot in this frame by frame. What the thought process was, why they did what they did, what they were feeling in the aftermath, what after they left the palace, what happened then, the impacts on all the careers involved. Very good perspective.
So if you haven't gone back and looked at this game or watched this game in a while, we actually did an episode on this game itself. We went back and watched the entire game. There's not a lot about the game that was too exciting until these final minutes. I mean, it was a blowout, as you see. But I think what's important to understand in this event and in this moment was that these two teams were at the top of basketball, especially in the Eastern Conference. And the Pacers finally felt like they've been so close for a long time that they had finally put the pieces together to go ahead and knock off this Detroit team that beat them the previous year in the Eastern Conference Finals in a very physical matchup. And this was their chance to kind of come back and make send a statement that, hey, listen, we are here and we're the best team. We're taking this from you.
Yeah, because remember, we're in that mid-November time frame. So the teams have played roughly 10 games at this point. We're building up to this game at the Palace, where Indiana's coming in there trying to set the tone for the season. Okay, you beat us last year. It's going to be different this year. I believe they said Indiana was off to like a 7-2 or 8-2 start heading into this game, and they went in there on a mission. And like you said, there's not much to talk about from the game itself because Indiana dominated.
They did, and it was a blowout. And so I didn't know, Mike, so leading up to this moment where everything kind of spirals out of control, I didn't realize that in this moment, Jamal Tinsley, the point guard for the Pacers, came over to Ron Artest during this game in those final couple of minutes and told him, hey, this is a chance for you to get your foul. Were you aware that they made it seem like in this documentary that Tinsley is basically the one that kind of incited Artest to go after Wallace underneath the basket on a foul when the game was out of reach? Didn't matter. The game was over.
Yeah, first off, Jamal Tinsley not in this documentary. Would have liked to seen him in it.
Yeah.
But you could clearly hear him, that they show the footage from the game. A lot of unique footage from this game that you probably haven't seen before in this. And you could see him mouthing it to Artest. And then Stephen Jackson talking about it in this and basically saying, like, you don't need to remind Ron or give him a reason to do something like that. Like, he was basically gaslighting him to do it, And he may say, well, Ron Artest is an adult. But as we'll go through, Ron Artest at this time is an adult that's borderline not in his right mind overall.
Yeah. Because they talked about the trade to the Pacers when they kind of give the backstory on building this team to where it is. But he's even so much so that, like, when he got traded, he just went about and did his own thing. Even though everybody was telling him, hey, get out of here, you don't go to practice, you're not on the team anymore, essentially. He just continued to do his own thing. And I think that's also a very unique part of this is hearing how this whole team was put together. And I know you're fascinated with the kind of the front office portion of sports and how trades are made and how rosters are compiled and how teams are built. But this one's really fascinating because Jermaine O'Neal was a guy that was basically kind of overlooked because he was so young when he got into the NBA, didn't have a lot of opportunity with the Trailblazers, and was brought over by Indiana in a time where they were getting rid of some of their guys that had been around all through those 90s that had anchored them, those big men down low. And nobody really appreciated or were excited about him coming over, really thought that he was kind of running off these veterans that had done so much for him. But turns out like he was a really a crucial piece of that team when they traded for him. And adding Ron Artest and then Stephen Jackson to kind of finish it all off, I thought it was really cool to hear how that all came together.
Yeah, and it was funny when he first got to Indiana when he was somewhere and someone was talking about him and he overheard and they said, this is the guy we traded for Dale Davis.
Yeah.
Dale Davis, of course, one of those power forwards from the earlier Pacers with Rick Smits and Antonio Davis. It's just funny thinking about what Jermaine O'Neal ended up becoming, a significantly better player than Dale Davis, but that's what people thought of Jermaine O'Neal when he first came there. He was relatively unknown probably in Indiana circles. Then you add Artest and Stephen Jackson, and Donnie Walsh, put this whole team together. It was his brainchild, and he went from seemingly in a 5-minute span from being proud of what he had put together to feeling responsible for what happened.
Yeah, that's
tough. You felt in it, if you watch this and don't feel something for Donnie Walsh, because you could tell it still bothers him a lot. Like, he feels very responsible, even though he wasn't on the court throwing haymakers.
And but what with the era of basketball that we're in right now, Mike, where it's a lot of defense still, very physical. You don't have nearly the physical play that then or today as we saw then. But they built this team really well to go against that Detroit team, who was the top of the East with Rasheed Wallace and Ben Wallace and just a very, very aggressive defensively built team that they were positioned perfectly to go against them. And O'Neal could go inside and out. But what they pointed out was O'Neal was the guy that could stop you at the rim. And then Artest is the guy that could stop you out on the perimeter. And these guys were lockdowns.
Yeah, they complemented each other very well, right? Like, if you have a good big man behind you defensively, that allows Artest to be more aggressive, right? If a guy beats him every once in a while, who cares? They complemented each other well on the court, but as you would find out, even before this game, maybe didn't see eye to eye all the time off the court and on the court when they were playing. And that was a constant battle for Reggie Miller, who was the elder statesman at this time. This would be his last season in the NBA, trying to get these guys to realize what they have and come together and get on the same page. You could just tell what I got from Reggie Miller, who is the first time I ever heard him talk about this incident before, is just a feeling of desperation. Like, you guys don't realize what you have, get your stuff together. And it seems like he could never really get through to both of them.
Yeah, and Artest, I mean, we know Artest's career. He was a very unique individual on the court and off the court, and just very hard-headed, and they could never get him to settle in and know his role and not be so temperamental. And I just didn't realize Jermaine O'Neal and him just didn't get along that well either. And, obviously with this event, I think there's still a lot of ill will towards him. But as this thing plays out, Mike, so what did you think about the way that they kind of explained the event, I guess almost frame by frame, and how they went through it? What to you was, I guess, maybe the biggest surprise, or what was one thing that you really learned from this?
The one thing I learned is how much offense everyone took when Artest laid on the scorer's table.
Right.
Like, from a fan standpoint, you're like, oh, the guy laid on the scorer's table. But you had Ben Wallace saying that was almost worse than him hard fouling me. Mm-hmm. Was him laying on the scorer's table. And then from the event itself, they had footage from the arena. So giving kind of footage of all angles. And I went into this not really feeling either way about the incident, but sort of feeling like a lot of the situations the players were put in, obviously outside of Artest, who ran into the stands.
Yeah.
But a lot of the other players were put in situations where they needed to defend themselves. And I don't look at that as being as bad as I maybe did like in the moment, years ago when this happened.
Yeah, that's kind of what you hear a lot of. And even for Artest, I mean, things had basically cooled off. And Artest, maybe it was a slap in the face to lay on that scores table. I didn't think it was that big of a deal, but as he explained it, like he'd been kind of in therapy, like anger management was like, hey, just take a few seconds, breathe, and before you react. And I think that's kind of, at least what he said is kind of the way he was working through that and processing all his emotions in the moment. But as that beer comes down and hits him, that's what spurs everything. But I thought I loved hearing Stephen Jackson during this. I thought he was hilarious. I respect him. He's a guy that he keeps it real, 100%. And he's a guy that just backs up his team. That's what he said essentially is, hey, I went in there to have my brother's back in this moment. I think he kind of gets thrown on the bus a lot as just being a guy out of control and angry. But you hear a side of it. I mean, I came out of this really, really liking Stephen Jackson was all said and done.
Yeah, so Stephen Jackson, boils it down to its simplest form. Like a situation that people think was very complicated, and they sort of look into it a lot. His thing was, my good teammate, my good friend, was in a situation where he might have gotten jumped by, multiple dozen people, so I just went and helped him out. That was Stephen Jackson's take. And when you boil it down like that, like that's what I meant before, like you start to understand a little bit why the actions were the way they were. And remember, in the moment, they were barred from talking about this.
Yeah.
So it's not like, the incident happened and they were at a press conference the next day. I've heard Stephen Jackson talk about it before. I've heard Jermaine O'Neal talk about it before. I never really heard Donnie Walsh. I never really heard Reggie Miller. I heard Artest, but Artest even, we'll get into him in a second, but he doesn't come off great in this at all to me. But just to kind of, Stephen Jackson, though, I think comes off the most genuine for sure. And Jermaine O'Neal does as well.
Stephen Jackson had one of the best lines in this whole movie. Or this whole documentary. I don't remember exactly what it was, but they're talking about security in this game, which there essentially wasn't any, which is still wild to think because remember we're right after 9/11, right, and a lot's happening. And there just wasn't a lot of security. I had a couple cops that were in this that were assigned duty that night, but they were like on the other side of the arena or something when everything kind of unfolded and escalated really quickly. But all these cops are coming down and trying to break things up, and Reggie Miller, who's trying to kind of corral Artest and trying to get on the court with some of these guys and get them off and into the locker room. The cops are coming over, and they show some footage of one of the cops that basically kind of raises up the mace like he's going to spray Reggie Miller in the face. Who's not doing anything. It's Reggie Miller, right? I mean, this guy's at this point in his career, this is his final years. You mentioned like he's an untouchable, and if you don't know Reggie Miller, like you've had your head in the sand, especially if you're working games like this. But he said the cops didn't have any idea who Reggie was. Like
that's crap.
How is that?
Crap.
Yeah, is there any way that's true?
It's not because I'll break it down for you. He's in the NBA for 18 years, okay? And he might be the most identifiable looking athlete, one of them in our generation.
Yeah.
Just by the way he physically looks. And he's 6'7". So, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think it's the cops, sort of having, 15 years or whatever to think about it and, saying, oh, this sounds good. You know what I mean? And when it sounds terrible.
Yeah, kind of formulating a new story in their mind through the years. But I mean, I don't know how that would be possible that you're unaware of who Reggie is. But even if that was the case, that this guy who's like you said 6'7" in a suit with a cast on his hand because he had been injured, wasn't playing this night, is not part of the party that's escalating things, right? That made no sense to me. But the fans are out of control. But the other cool thing about this documentary is they hear the fans. We get to hear from the fans that were involved. One, the dude that came on the court that I always thought looked like Turtle from Entourage, that came down and after Ron Artest was out of the stands and kind of bowed up to Artest and eventually got taken out in a stretcher. How does this guy agree to come on the documentary, Mike?
Did he act like he did?
Did he
act like he did?
Right. He had the balls to believe that he was like not doing anything wrong in the moment. Tell us.
Yeah, he came across. If there's only one person who came across worse than Artest, it was this guy Haddad was his last name, right?
Yeah, something like that.
I forget. He came across really bad. The guy John Green, who threw the cup, is talked about a lot in this, but is not in the documentary. He came across what was it, like an interview he did or something?
Yeah, with like it looked like maybe a local TV station.
Jesus, man.
I'd never seen that. Did you?
Well, what is his problem, that guy? Like, he incited a riot,
And he thought it was funny.
that's his attitude. Yeah, he was treating it like a joke. What a weird reaction that was. And that was, again, that was after the fact, but like more, maybe like, within a week afterwards, I believe. But yeah, the fans came across terrible. I mean, I feel, they sort of explained like how Pistons fans are. They're very loyal, passionate, but they're not, to brand the whole fan base like that, I don't think is fair. You had, maybe 15, 20 people really inciting things that were going on there, and things got out of hand. I don't think it's fair to brand the whole fan base that way.
No, but it was an ugly night, and we saw, all the footage of stuff being thrown, the chair being thrown. It's trying to get off the court.
I don't know why that's not talked about more.
Yeah, I don't know either. That's when things were beyond had gone way out of control at that point. And this point, we had Artest and Jackson off the court, and Jermaine O'Neal still trying to come down, and things were being thrown down. But the other interesting part of this is what happens after they get off the court and they're in the locker room. And I know we talked about this on our show we did before. The famous line from this is that Ron Artest asks, Stephen Jackson, as they're sitting in the locker room, hey, do you think we'll get in trouble for this? Right? Which is incredible. But I didn't realize that, with this this kind of feud between Artest and O'Neal, just never get on the same page, that was also what Artest was worried about. Like, Jermaine's going to come in here and be angry with me. And he was. And Jermaine even laid it out for him. Why that was the case that night as he went in there, about how pissed off he was that everything went the way it did.
Yeah, and look, they do a good job in this of talking about kind of who lost what from this, right? And they're right. From a basketball perspective, Jermaine O'Neal lost the most, right? Sure, it would have been nice to get Reggie Miller a championship on the way out, but from like a that moment in time going forward basketball career standpoint, Jermaine O'Neal stood to lose the most. And I think people started to realize that very soon thereafter, even maybe in the locker room. And that's what led to his emotions and led to Artest kind of knowing what's coming with him, where they almost came to blows in the locker room. Mm-hmm. And Stephen Jackson talking about Artest asking him if he thought they were going to get in trouble is hilarious.
Still.
I mean, it just shows you Artest was in like a state, even on the court, where it looked like he was having some kind of episode. You know what I mean? Like, people were even trying to like slap him in the face to try to make hey, are you with us? You know what I mean? Are you hearing what I'm saying? Kind of like slaps in the face. Just ugly all around.
It was. The other angle to this whole event was the fallout afterwards and what happens with David Stern and the suspensions. And that's still, the biggest thing about this is that this team that was right there especially after this win early in the season, established themselves as probably the favorite in the East and maybe the entire NBA that year. The Stern hands down these suspensions and basically is the judge, jury, and executioner in all this. And I think to this day, I don't know that anybody would justify the actual suspensions because, you're talking about Artest for the entire season, right? I don't remember the specific amount of days and games for Stephen Jackson O'Neal, but they're all over 30
It's 25.
Games.
Okay. I think it was 25 for 30 for Jackson, 25 for O'Neal.
Right. Okay. So obviously a very significant part of the portion of this season, but losing Artest is the biggest blow for the whole year, and they can never overcome. And it's basically Reggie's hurrah. He knows in that moment that, hey, this thing's over with and there's nothing we can do about it. But do you think things would be different today? And do you think Stern doesn't get enough, maybe backlash for how this all unfolded? Because we talk about the incident, but I don't think people spend as much time talking about, hey, these guys, although they did a horrible thing, the punishment they got greatly outweighed the crime.
Yeah, so you know how Adam Silver gets praised in some circles and criticized in some circles for how he handles things? He seems right. And he seems to handle things more in favor of like the players, let's say, just overall. You know what I mean? Well, you got to remember, back then, and that's largely a function of how the media covers the NBA right now, back then, the media was covering the NBA the exact opposite, right? They were saying, oh, these guys are thugs, David Stern needs to get his league in line. So I think that had a lot to do with his reaction, right? And I also think you got to remember, David Stern built the NBA from the early 80s. They go from Magic and Bird to Jordan to now we're at the tail end of Kobe and Shaq, right? So we got like a significant amount of time here where the NBA is like top rung, you know? And I think this was an incident where Stern said, I don't want to lose everything we've built here for the last, 25, 30 years. So we're going to nip this in the bud. We're going to put, were all the decisions he made right? Probably not. But remember, he did act very quick, and I thought he felt it necessary to sort of save what he had built. I think that was his vantage point. Whether it was right or not, obviously can be debated.
It can, and I think I don't remember who mentioned it during this, but essentially what the guys committed was like a misdemeanor assault charge, and here they are getting these punishments for the year. And I get it, it's different, right? I mean, you have to set a precedent in many ways with Artest and a guy going into the stands to fight a fan like that. But still, I still think it was still too much. And I hate it for Reggie. I mean, no matter how you feel about Reggie, he had a chance, I think, in this year to finally get that shot. And he had a couple of them before, but always ran into great teams, right? And finally maybe had his team put together that was better than anybody else and couldn't quite get there.
Yeah, it's You leave this feeling for Reggie Miller because you tell he's emotional about it. Donnie Walsh was emotional. Everyone was emotional about it in their own way, except for it seemed like Artest. to be honest with you, Artest goes on, latches on with the Lakers, wins a championship. So
and that rubbed it in even more to those guys too.
Because remember the big part of this too is Artest sat out the whole year. The organization was loyal to him, didn't abandon him, and then he asked for a trade.
Yeah.
So that was a huge part of this too, and a reason why the relationships between all these players is pretty strained. It seems like even maybe to this day, is that he asked out. Artest realizes now, I think that was probably the wrong way to handle things, but he from a basketball standpoint, he ended up having the most success on the court after this.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting part of this to me, which is kind of everybody felt about him in the way that he left like that after they had come to his defense and backed him up and gone through everything with him they did, that he just kind of upped and was just like, all right, I'm just going to get out of here and leave these guys behind. I thought that was an interesting part because it does seem like, I don't know, it seems like Jermaine O'Neal has not gotten over this moment at all.
No, he was talking about he didn't feel comfortable. He didn't feel like this could get behind him until the Palace was torn down. I mean, that's impacting someone, Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying it's not genuine how he feels. I'm just saying that sort of took me by surprise.
Yeah, it all did. It was really interesting. What else, Mike, from this did you take away and want to talk about?
So to be honest, I wanted more from Tim Donaghy.
Oh, yeah, I totally forgot about Tim Donaghy.
So Tim Donaghy was a ref in this game. We all know what Tim Donaghy would become known for afterwards with the gambling scandal. But he's a ref right in the middle of this. And he had a funny remark in this. If you never heard Tim Donaghy talks, he talks with a very thick Philly accent. Mm-hmm. And him saying, when you had a game with Stephen Jackson, Ron Artest, Rasheed Wallace, and Ben Wallace, that you were going to be in for a long night. You know what I mean?
Right.
That it was remember, this is a nationally televised Friday night NBA on ESPN game here. Yep. So there's a lot of eyeballs on here. Mike Breen on the call, so this is a marquee game for the NBA, and this happens too. So that only added to the that only added fuels to the fire as far as the reaction to everything. But Donaghy, I'd like to hear him talk about it more.
Yeah, I totally. That's just one extra added element to this whole thing that often gets forgotten about. The fact that
is that Tim? They show the pre-games. Is that Tim Donaghy? Wow, you forget.
I know, and he's there, and right, we're not nothing's being taught. He's just another guy. It's what if you didn't know any of the backstory on the guy, you would just think he's just another NBA official.
Yeah, why are they interviewing some random official? Why don't they interview all the other officials? It's Tim Donaghy.
That was. Yeah, that's a good point. This all around was a very good documentary. I thought that was I enjoyed and learned a lot about how these guys felt about it and what they think about on it now. Because we don't hear about them as much as you mentioned. They weren't able to really defend themselves in the moment when it happened. They couldn't really speak out about punishment, about how they were treated and any of that stuff. They were immediately the enemy when it happened and still thought about. But you come back many years later and you see the fans, the two key fans involved in this, and it makes you lean more and more towards the players. And we know that they defend themselves in their moment, but still, even Artest going up there, those two guys especially, they came out of this thing. You're going, I don't know how you'd show your face on this thing, even more than 15 years later, why you thought it was a good idea to speak out. Even though that one guy didn't, he had the recorded interview, but either way, after the fact, these guys looking back on it thought they were in the right or didn't really do anything wrong. Still blows my mind.
I was like flabbergasted by the guy who they interviewed for this in present day.
Yeah.
Like still like justifying what he did. Like, oh God, man.
What are you thinking?
What a bizarre set of circumstances. But
It was.
I'm interested to see, Ben, what this Untold series, what's next here. Because like you said, I think it's a series that they're probably releasing one by one. Mm-hmm. Because this one is getting a lot of attention.
It's getting a ton. And if you haven't seen it, definitely go through it. I'm assuming that it's a sports documentary.
If it is, we're here for it.
They got Caitlyn Jenner, I think, is coming up next.
Oh, boy.
So they have that. I've seen something on a boxer maybe coming up down the road. So it looks like it will be a lot of that. So that will be very interesting to see. And we'll be on top of that as they come out, especially if they remain to be sports. Because if they're all kind of similar to this, I think I'm in on it because this was a really well-told story, and they did a good job of getting everybody involved. That was a key piece of this, for minus one or two figures maybe. But we got to hear everybody's side of the story on this thing, and it was good because I learned a lot, and you understand a lot more of where they're coming from and still to this day how they feel about it.
Yeah, very well done, and the perspective was great. And yeah, like I said, I'm looking forward to the other installments of this.
Make sure you get subscribed on the podcast, and you won't miss it when we do talk about it here in probably another few weeks. I think that Caitlyn Jenner comes out, but we'll see how it all unfolds. But everything we do, true crime, go back to watching old games, all that stuff. Make sure you get subscribed. You won't miss a single episode, and we appreciate all the support.
Yeah, as always, like, subscribe, comment. We love hearing from you, and until next time.